Hi, I'm Mr. Simons, and in this video we're going to talk about the business cycle. Now, the business cycle describes fluctuations in economic activity over time. So there's a few things that we can break down in that description. So business cycles, cyclical changes, fluctuations. So what we're looking at is how economic activity changes over time. And when we talk about economic activity, what we're talking about is economic growth. We're talking about output in an economy. So if we think about the business cycle, that's really showing us how economic growth, how output changes over time in a particular economy. What's also interesting, and something that we need to be clear about, is that the business cycle tells us what to expect at different levels of economic growth. Something that I tell the students I teach, and something that might be useful for you to think about, is that when we talk about an economy, it can seem like this large blob mass, who even knows what it means, that I find it useful to break down an economy into three groups. We talk about individuals, firms, and the government. So when we're talking about the business cycle, we're thinking about how fluctuations in economic activity are going to affect individuals, firms, and the government. Why don't we get into it? We're going to start with looking at how we draw the business cycle, and then we'll talk about what happens at different points in the business cycle. So let's get started. Okay, so here we are in terms of the business cycle. So let's get our pen together. So on this side, we've got GDP, gross domestic product. Now I'm not going to go into this into too much detail here. Just for our purposes at this stage, you can think, okay, GDP, this is about the amount of output that an economy produces. So the amount of goods, G, plus S, services that an economy produces. So, okay, so we've got GDP on that side, and on this side, we're talking about time. So we're talking about time, and we're sort of looking at years. So what we might sort of think about seeing, and this is our first version of the graph, is that, okay, so growth will go up, it will come down, it will slow, it will go up, it will come down, it will slow, it will go up, it will come down, it will slow. That this is the essential pattern of the business cycle, so that we've got, okay, GDP is getting higher, GDP is getting lower. So the issue with this version of the graph though, let's grab a different colored pen, let's grab purple, let's get a straight line going here, that the issue with this is if we took a sort of a trend or an average and we went all the way across here, that we can see that on the whole, the sort of average level of GDP is flat. Now, you might put this trend line a little bit higher, a little bit lower, I don't mind, but you kind of look at this average and you're kind of like, well, on average, it's kind of a bit flat, that the trend for GDP here is that GDP is not rising over time. So our principle is sound here, that if we go up, the economy is growing, if we go down, the economy is slowing, but this is not what the trend looks like. So let's construct another version of the graph. And this second version is the one that we tend to use. So let's start again, and we'll do this graph we'll do it in blue. GDP here again, that remains the same. And then here we've got time, and we've got zero here. So the pattern is going to be the same, right? There's going to be the ups and downs, but the trend is going to be different. So the way we tend to draw it is that the trend, we'll put this in purple, is that the trend for GDP over time is not that it remains flat. Instead, if you looked at the trend here, that the trend is that GDP will increase over time. Please note though that there are still the same patterns of rises and falls in the level of GDP, in the level of, let's add an extra term here, in the level of economic activity. That's still happening, but the trend is actually that GDP will be rising over time. Okay, so now let's pick, say, 2 points on this business cycle and start to think about what they look like, what is happening at each of these points. Okay, so let's start with green, and let's say that green is where we're on an upswing, and we'll call this sort of point A. So we're looking here at point A, and that we can see that point A involves this increase in gross domestic product. Okay, cool. So what we can say here is that point A, that point A represents an upswing or an expansion of the economy. And the evidence for that is that we've got an increase in gross domestic product. And that when point A goes all the way to the top here, we can call this here point B, right at the top, that point B is a boom. This is the high point of economic activity in the business cycle. This is a really strong point in terms of GDP and economic growth. If we then look at the sort of negative, and let's put it in red, obviously, that if we think about sort of coming down this side, that once we move down from the boom, we can call this point C here. Point C, that we're seeing that decline in GDP. And so what we can say here is that we can say here that this GDP fall represents a downturn or a contraction of the economy. So these are two separate terms. I'll just go back to that green thing, that it's an upswing or an expansion of the economy. They're two terms that mean the same thing. If we then look at it, that if point C continues on its decline and gets all the way to this bottom point D, that point D, we call that a recession. And that is very much the low point of economic activity. So we can see that there are sort of different phases in the business cycle. And that what we can do is, let's start from the start here. So we can say that, we can say that 1, the trend in the business cycle is that GDP rises over time. We could say that our second idea here is the fact that there is a upswing and a boom in terms of increasing economic activity. And then our third point here is that, okay, there can also be a downturn, contraction, and recession in economic activity as well. And those are all parts of the business cycle. Okay, so now let's go into a little bit more detail about each of those stages. Okay, so let's make it simple and think about this boom and the recession part of the business cycle. And that what you'll see is that sort of like, when one happens on one side, you get the opposite on the other side. So let's think about it in terms of boom, that we might start with this idea that there's an increasing production of goods and services. Well, get that right. Increasing production of goods and services, that GDP represents output. So as more is being produced, well, there's more goods and services in the economy. That on the recession, you're just going to get the flip side, right? That, so there's actually that falling production of goods plus services. If we come back over to the boom here, that something we can also think about is that when the economy is going well, people are spending and people investing. So we can say that there are rising levels of consumption, which our symbol is C, not the copyright symbol, just C. So there are rising levels of consumption and investment. In terms of the recession, it's just that opposite situation, that when the economy is slow, less people are spending, less people are investing. So C here being consumption and I being investment. Okay, so another factor that we are looking at here is that when there is more goods and services being produced, more consumption, more investment, that actually more people need to be employed. So falling unemployment, UE is just the abbreviation there for unemployment, that there is more people that are needed to work in jobs to produce those extra goods and services. So if we then flick over to the recession, we can think about, okay, so if we flick over to the recession part, there's less demand for goods and services when the economy is slowing, so firms will need to hire less people, so actually unemployment will rise. Unemployment will rise. If we then think about this situation, if more people have jobs, more people are earning wages, so therefore incomes will rise in the economy. On this, if less people have jobs, income will fall. It's just you're not receiving a wage, so you don't have as much income. If we then think about how this shakes out overall, that in terms of a boom, we might see rising quality of life, that people's living standards will be higher. If we flick over this side, that if we think about it, if fewer people have jobs, if more people have less income, then we're likely to see that quality of life will fall. That is likely to be the turn of events. So what we can do is we can add some bullet points here. That's always good for things. And then we can see the recession will be on this side. So what we can sort of look at now is that we are very much able to say that at these different points of the business cycle, well, these different things are going to be happening. And if we think about it even further, what we could do is we could add something here. We could say, and let's put this in a different color. Okay, so what we could also say here is that if there is rising unemployment, then what we might see is there is an increase in that. If unemployment will rise, okay, so there's likely to be more government spending on unemployment benefits in the economy. And you can see that on this side, if there is falling unemployment, well, then there will be less in that boom. If we then think about one more element, and let's put this in blue, if we think about here, if more people have jobs and more people are earning income, that if more people have jobs and more people are earning income, well, then there will be greater tax revenue for the government, because remember that the government will collect income tax from people. If incomes are higher, that tax revenue will be larger. If we then flick onto this side, we can think actually there will be falling tax revenue for governments. And that's kind of how we would look at elements and positions in the business cycle. So that was our discussion of the business cycle. It's very important that you can draw it accurately with the trend line going up that way, and that you can also discuss in detail what happens at different stages of the business cycle. So if we're at point A or point B, how could we distinguish that from point C and point D? What would be the differences that we would discuss in terms of the things that we would see for individuals, firms, and the government? Put any questions in the comments. And as always, thank you very much for watching.